"You think this rifle is too old for you, old man?" The words cut through the warm morning air of the firing range, sharp and dripping with the unearned confidence of youth. A line of recruits, helmets tilted back and fingers brushing the edges of their rifles, smirked as they handed Dean Peters, 82 years old, a faded M40 with a deep gouge along the walnut stock. Dean's hands, weathered and steady, closed around the rifle as his pale blue eyes scanned the target, distant and small against the rolling hills of the base. Sunlight shimmered off the metal, heat rising in a haze that twisted the edges of the range flags fluttering in the wind. Lance Corporal Evans, barely 22, leaned in with a grin, his voice dripping with mockery. "Bet you've never handled something like this before, Pops." Dean didn't flinch. He tilted the rifle slightly, feeling the familiar weight, the grooves of the stock worn smooth by years of practice, the faint scar left by a mortar fragment long ago. The world seemed to shift subtly, the air thickening, carrying the faint scent of cordite and leather as memory stirred. For a heartbeat, he was not 82, but 19 again, crouched in a jungle under the oppressive heat, palms sweaty and eyes locked on a fragile target hundreds of meters away. The sound of wind through leaves, distant calls of comrades, the soft thump of makeshift ammunition hitting earth, all returned to him with vivid clarity. Dean's thumb brushed the safety, his breath even and deliberate, tuning into rhythms of the rifle, the wind, the rising heat, the subtle currents over the undulating terrain. Gunnery Sergeant Miller, standing to the side, watched closely, eyes narrowing as he sensed the shift in atmosphere, a weight settling over the range. He knew, from countless mornings spent observing, when a veteran was about to remind everyone of a truth often forgotten by those who judged too quickly. Evans shifted uncomfortably, sensing a tension that had nothing to do with the rifle itself. Dean's gaze was calm, almost meditative, following invisible lines through the air, a map of experience etched deep in his muscles and memory. The recruit's smirks faltered as the rifle moved, alignment precise, trigger finger poised, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the distant flags rippling in a wind that no one else could feel. The subtle creak of the stock, the faint scent of oil, the metallic tang of the barrel, all part of a ritual they didn't understand. Dean exhaled slowly, a single, measured breath, and the scope aligned with the target. Time itself seemed to compress as the release came, and the rifle responded like an extension of Dean's own intent, honed by decades that no young corporal could fathom. In the back of his mind, flashes of jungles and mountains, of missions that never left the records but left marks on his hands, guided the bullet's path. The range was silent but for the distant hum of flags snapping in the wind, the recruit's frozen mid-laugh, Miller's eyes wide with recognition, the sun blazing off the metal stand as if spotlighting what was about to unfold. Dean's focus never wavered, his shoulders steady, fingers light but commanding, and the bullet struck true, knocking the target clean off the stand, sending a small cloud of dust and disbelief into the air. Evans staggered back, jaw tight, eyes wide, suddenly realizing that the old man they had mocked carried within him a precision and experience that no amount of modern training could replicate. The other recruits shifted uneasily, the smirk fading, the heat and wind now carrying a sense of awe. Dean lowered the rifle slowly, eyes meeting each of them in turn, pale blue steady, voice calm, almost a whisper above the hum of the day. Experience never fades. Respect it. The silence lingered longer than anyone expected. It was not the stunned silence that followed a lucky shot. It was something heavier, something uncomfortable. The target frame stood empty at the far end of the range, its metal stand leaning slightly where the impact had knocked the silhouette completely free. The recruits stared through spotting scopes and binoculars, searching for an explanation that fit the story they had already written in their heads. Dean Peters was supposed to be a harmless old visitor. He was supposed to miss. He was supposed to prove them right. Instead, the warm afternoon air carried only the sound of distant range flags snapping against their poles and the low hum of generators near the equipment shed. Lance Corporal Evans swallowed hard. The grin that had lived on his face all morning was gone now. He looked from the empty stand to the worn M40 resting in Dean's hands. The rifle suddenly seemed less like an antique and more like a piece of history that had somehow wandered into the present. That was impossible, one recruit muttered. Another shook his head. No way he saw that wind change. Dean heard every word. He simply returned the rifle to the shooting bench and brushed a thumb across the scarred walnut stock. The deep gouge caught the sunlight for a moment. His eyes settled there longer than necessary. The smell of gun oil drifted upward. Beneath it came something older. Something buried beneath decades of quiet civilian life. Leather. Rain. Humidity. The memory arrived without warning. A young Dean sat beneath a canopy of dense jungle leaves. Water dripped steadily from broad green branches overhead. Everything felt damp. His uniform, his hands, even the rifle resting across his knees. Around him, voices stayed low. The mission depended on patience. Nobody rushed. Nobody spoke unless necessary. The only movement came from a small cloth tied high in a distant tree branch. The fabric fluttered almost invisibly. Most people would never notice it. Dean noticed everything. A slight shift in wind. A change in temperature. A bird altering its flight path. The world spoke through details. Survival depended on listening. The memory faded as quickly as it arrived. Back on the range, Dean blinked once and returned to the present. Gunnery Sergeant Miller had not taken his eyes off him. The veteran's posture. The way he handled the rifle. The way he watched the environment instead of the equipment. None of it matched the image of an ordinary retiree. Miller had spent enough years around shooters to recognize something rare when he saw it. He quietly stepped away from the firing line and pulled a phone from his pocket. His thumb moved across the screen. Evans noticed, but said nothing. Miller reached a number few people on base possessed. The line connected after 2 rings. "Sir," Miller said carefully, "I think you need to hear this." On the other end, Colonel Richards paused. "What happened?" Miller glanced back toward Dean. The old man stood alone beside the bench while recruits watched from a respectful distance they had not shown him an hour earlier. "There is an 82-year-old visitor on Range 7. The colonel laughed softly. "And?" Miller took a slow breath. "He just made a shot nobody here thought was possible." The line went quiet. For several seconds, only static answered him. Then the colonel spoke again, his voice noticeably different. "What did you say his name was?" Miller looked toward Dean Peters as sunlight reflected from the faded gouge in the old rifle stock. Something told him this story was only beginning. "Dean Peters, sir." Another pause followed. Longer this time. Then a chair scraped sharply somewhere on the other end of the call. "Stay where you are," Colonel Richards said. "Do not let him leave the range. I am on my way." The call ended, but Gunnery Sergeant Miller continued staring at the phone for a moment. The reaction on the other end had unsettled him. Colonels did not abandon meetings because of an ordinary range visitor. They certainly did not sound as though someone had just spoken a name from a forgotten chapter of military history. Across the firing line, Dean Peters remained exactly where he had been. Calm, patient, unmoved by the attention gathering around him. The afternoon sun hung high above the rolling hills, casting long shimmering waves of heat across the range. Dust drifted lazily along the gravel paths between shooting positions. The recruits no longer laughed. They stood in small groups, speaking in hushed voices while stealing glances toward the old veteran. Lance Corporal Evans shifted awkwardly beside the bench. The confidence that had fueled him all morning had evaporated. In its place sat a growing curiosity. He studied Dean carefully. The old man did not look legendary. His faded work shirt showed years of wear. His boots were practical rather than impressive. There were no medals on display, no patches, no decorations, nothing that explained what had just happened. And yet something about him demanded attention. Dean rested a hand on the weathered M40. His fingers traced the familiar gouge along the walnut stock. The rough edge caught against his skin. Instantly, another memory surfaced. A narrow mountain ridgeline stretched beneath a cold gray sky. The wind moved differently there. Sharp. Unpredictable. Every gust carried information. Young Dean lay prone beneath a camouflage tarp while fog drifted through distant pine trees. Beside him sat an older instructor whose face had long since faded from memory. Yet his voice remained clear. "Most people look at the target," the instructor had said. "The best shooters look at everything except the target." Young Dean had not understood at first. Then the lessons began. Watch the grass. Watch the birds. Watch the shadows moving across distant slopes. Listen to the air. Feel it against your face. Every detail mattered. Every detail told a story. The memory faded with the sound of a vehicle approaching from across the base. Dean opened his eyes and returned to the present. A black staff vehicle moved quickly along the access road, throwing dust into the sunlight behind it. Several recruits noticed it at the same time. Conversation stopped. The vehicle was traveling far too fast for a routine visit. Miller recognized the markings immediately. His posture straightened. Evans followed his gaze. "Who was that?" he asked quietly. Miller did not answer right away. The vehicle rolled to a stop near the range office. The driver's door opened first. Then Colonel Richards stepped out. Even from a distance, his urgency was obvious. He did not pause to greet anyone. He did not speak to the staff waiting nearby. His eyes locked immediately onto Dean Peters. For a brief moment, the entire range seemed suspended in silence. The flags continued snapping in the wind. Heat shimmered above the gravel. Somewhere beyond the hills, a helicopter hummed faintly through the afternoon sky. Colonel Richards began walking toward the firing line with purposeful strides. The closer he came, the more recruits noticed something unusual. It was not authority they saw on his face. It was recognition. And beneath that recognition was something even rarer: respect. Colonel Richards approached the firing line with measured steps, his polished boots crunching over the gravel, the sunlight catching the brass buttons on his uniform and casting fleeting reflections across the range. His eyes remained locked on Dean Peters, observing every subtle motion, every small adjustment of the rifle, every breath that seemed in rhythm with the faint shimmer of heat rising from the gravel. Recruits instinctively straightened their postures, as though sensing that a presence of authority had entered the space beyond normal command, a presence that carried weight not just from rank, but from recognition of skill. Dean did not turn toward the colonel, his focus still on the target area beyond 100 yards, yet a slight acknowledgement passed between them, subtle but unmistakable, a silent nod of mutual understanding. The breeze shifted slightly, and the flags lining the range snapped sharply, carrying the scent of gun oil and warm asphalt, mingling with the distant aroma of dry grass and sun-baked soil. Lance Corporal Evans felt a tightness in his chest, the easy arrogance he had relied on all morning dissipating into a mixture of awe and uncertainty. He glanced at the other recruits. They were frozen in the same disbelief, whispering quietly among themselves while stealing glances at Dean and the approaching colonel. Gunnery Sergeant Miller stepped closer to Dean, his own posture straightening, a hand hovering near the old veteran, not in assistance, but in recognition of the unspoken understanding of what was about to happen next. Dean's fingers caressed the worn walnut stock, the gouge reflecting sunlight like a scar that held a story, a silent testament to years of practice, focus, and quiet discipline. The memory surfaced again briefly, a flash of a distant ridge under an overcast sky, the wind shifting unpredictably, the small movements of leaves and grass providing information only those who had learned to observe could understand. The range seemed to hold its breath. Colonel Richards stopped a few paces short, taking in the scene, eyes narrowing slightly, the heat of the afternoon emphasizing the tension that hung between man, rifle, and target. Dean exhaled slowly, a deliberate movement that sent a ripple of calm through the immediate air, almost imperceptible, yet noticeable to those attuned to the subtle rhythms of seasoned experience. He raised the rifle, adjusting sight and grip with the precision of a life spent in continuous observation, the old leather strap brushing against his wrist, worn smooth, the mechanism clicking quietly as it settled into readiness. Evans' shoulders tightened, the easy mockery now replaced with a keen awareness that this moment was unlike any other on the range. The other recruits shifted uneasily, sensing the build of something that went beyond ordinary expectation. Dean's eyes, pale and steady, scanned the distance, accounting for wind, angle, and subtle currents in the air, drawing on knowledge that had been honed over decades, stored in muscle memory, intuition, and quiet discipline. He aligned the rifle carefully, paused, the faint whir of a distant helicopter blending with the ambient hum of the range, and released the shot. The sound carried cleanly across the gravel and dirt, followed by a sharp, precise impact. The target moved, tilting and then falling from its stand, sending a cloud of dust and a quiet exclamation of astonishment through the group. Every recruit froze, their eyes wide, breaths held. The energy on the range now tense with silent acknowledgement of the skill demonstrated. Colonel Richards finally exhaled, a small, impressed smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, a nod toward Dean, who lowered the rifle slowly, fingers lingering on the stock, a pale blue gaze steady and calm, carrying with it a quiet authority earned over a lifetime of experience. No one spoke for several seconds. The range, which had been filled with casual conversations and scattered laughter only minutes earlier, now felt strangely different. The air itself seemed heavier. Colonel Richards stepped forward and stopped beside the shooting bench. His eyes settled on the weathered M40 resting in Dean Peters's hands. For a moment, he looked less like a senior officer and more like someone revisiting a memory from long ago. The afternoon sun reflected softly across the rifle's worn metal surfaces while heat waves danced above the gravel. Dean remained calm, his posture relaxed, as if none of the attention mattered. Around them, the recruits stood motionless. Even Lance Corporal Evans seemed unsure what to do with himself. The certainty that had guided every word he had spoken that morning was gone. Colonel Richards slowly extended a hand toward the rifle. "May I?" he asked. The question surprised everyone. Officers usually gave instructions. They did not ask permission from quiet old visitors standing on training ranges. Dean offered a small nod and handed the rifle over. Richards examined the weapon carefully. His fingers paused when they reached the deep gouge carved into the walnut stock. The moment he touched it, something changed in his expression. Recognition. The colonel looked up at Dean. "I knew it." His voice was barely above a whisper. Evans exchanged confused glances with the other recruits. None of them understood what they were witnessing. Richards turned the rifle slightly and held the stock toward the sunlight. "You see this mark?" he asked. Nobody answered. The recruits leaned forward. "This rifle has been displayed in photographs at Fort Liberty for decades." A ripple of confusion moved through the group. Richards continued. "Most people never notice the gouge because they are looking at the rifle. The people who know the story look at the scar." Dean said nothing. The colonel smiled faintly. 39 years ago, this exact rifle was used during one of the most difficult mountain qualification courses ever recorded. The recruits listened carefully now. Not one of them dared interrupt. The wind tugged at the flags overhead, while distant clouds drifted across the bright blue sky. Richards handed the rifle back. The shooter completed every station with scores that remained untouched for years. Evans swallowed. "Who was the shooter, sir?" The colonel looked directly at Dean. The answer was obvious now, yet hearing it felt different. "The man standing in front of you." Silence returned. A deeper silence than before. Dean shifted slightly and rested the rifle against the bench. He seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention, as though the story belonged somewhere else. Somewhere in the past. Miller watched the recruits carefully. Their faces had changed. The smirks were gone. The dismissive expressions had vanished completely. Curiosity had replaced them. Respect was beginning to follow. Richards folded his arms and glanced toward the distant target line. Most people think great shooters see farther. His eyes returned to Dean. The truth is they notice more. A faint breeze crossed the range. Dean looked toward the hills beyond the targets. The same hills where heat shimmered across the landscape and flags whispered information to anyone patient enough to listen. For a brief moment, another memory surfaced. A younger version of himself standing beside an instructor on a remote ridge. Not learning how to shoot, learning how to observe, learning how to slow down, learning that skill was not speed. It was attention. When the memory faded, Dean found every recruit watching him differently. Not as an old man, not as a visitor, but as someone carrying lessons they had not yet learned. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the gravel and dust of the firing range. Dean Peters stood quietly beside the bench, his hands resting lightly on the stock of the M40, the grooves worn smooth by decades of practice. The recruits remained frozen, their earlier bravado evaporated under the weight of something they could not yet name. Lance Corporal Evans shifted uneasily, feeling a growing respect mixed with disbelief. The distant hills shimmered with heat, the flags snapping in the breeze carrying a faint whisper of information that only those who knew how to watch could understand. Gunnery Sergeant Miller moved silently along the line, his eyes scanning the faces of the young men, noting the change in posture, the widening of eyes, the sudden awareness that the lessons of experience were far deeper than any manual or training session. Colonel Richards, now standing closer, allowed himself a faint, approving nod, recognizing the old precision and quiet control that Dean carried effortlessly. The veteran tilted the rifle slightly, brushing the tip of his thumb along the metal, feeling the familiar coldness, the faint scratches and dents, each telling a story of a past that had shaped skill beyond measure. In the back of his mind, Dean recalled a narrow cliffside range under a gray, overcast sky, rain falling softly, fingers numb and eyes focused, each breath counted, each movement deliberate. That memory blended seamlessly with the present, informing every decision, every subtle shift in posture, every fraction of adjustment in aim. The recruits watched, collectively holding their breath, as Dean adjusted the sights once more, feeling the wind, the angle of the sun, the subtle vibration of the rifle against his hands. The hum of distant generators and the occasional rustle of the flags became part of the rhythm, a soundtrack to precision honed over decades. Colonel Richards stepped slightly closer, his presence firm but unobtrusive, allowing Dean to remain the center of focus while acknowledging the mastery he now understood. Evans dared a quiet question, his voice barely above the wind. "Sir, how does he do that?" Miller's eyes flicked to Dean, then back to the recruits. "It is not just practice," he said softly. "It is attention, observation, discipline learned over a lifetime." The heat shimmered along the range, and Dean exhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping across the targets in the distance, each one a measure not just of skill, but of patience and understanding. The silence was no longer tense. It was reverent, filled with recognition and something akin to awe. The recruits straightened, their minds processing what they had just witnessed, their earlier judgments replaced by a quiet acknowledgement of mastery that could not be earned overnight. Dean lowered the rifle fully, letting it rest on the bench, his eyes sweeping the line of young faces, pale blue and steady, carrying with them a calm authority. Colonel Richards finally spoke, his voice carrying easily across the range, firm but measured. "That is how precision endures," he said. "Not through speed, not through force, through years of attention and experience." The words settled over the range, the wind carrying them softly past the flags and across the gravel. Dean's gaze lingered on the horizon, on the distant hills, as if seeing lessons hidden in the sunlight and dust, allowing the young recruits to feel, for the first time, the weight of history and the quiet strength of skill perfected over a lifetime. The heat of the late afternoon softened, casting long shadows across the firing range as Dean Peters remained still, eyes sweeping the distant hills. Each recruit seemed suspended in their own thoughts, the earlier tension now transformed into a quiet awareness that demanded reflection. Lance Corporal Evans shifted his weight uneasily, realizing that every assumption he had carried all morning had been upended in the space of a single demonstration. Gunnery Sergeant Miller approached slowly, his boots stirring faint clouds of dust, and crouched slightly to bring his face closer to Dean without breaking the distance that marked respect. "You have patience most of them will never understand," Miller said quietly, voice low but deliberate, carrying across the gravel toward the nearest recruits. Dean acknowledged the comment with a slight nod, his eyes never leaving the contours of the landscape, reading the light, the shadows, the subtle signals carried by the flags, and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Colonel Richards, now fully on the line, allowed himself a measured glance, noting the way Dean's posture held centuries of experience, each movement precise, each gesture deliberate, a rhythm invisible to those who had not walked the same path. The young men observed, some craning their necks, others lowering their eyes in silent contemplation, each internalizing the demonstration in their own way. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of warm gravel and distant pine, mingling with the faint tang of gun oil from the rifle, a reminder that every detail held meaning when attention was paid. Dean's fingers traced lightly over the gouge in the stock, as though reading a story written long ago, one that connected every memory, every lesson, every discipline cultivated through decades. His gaze swept from one recruit to another, pale blue and steady, unflinching yet patient, a quiet authority that did not need to be proclaimed. Evan's lips parted slightly, as if to speak, then closed again, realizing no words were adequate. Miller watched the subtle shifts in demeanor among the recruits, noting the lowering of heads, the softened stance, the involuntary acknowledgement of mastery they could not replicate. Colonel Richards finally broke the silence, voice calm but commanding attention. "What we just witnessed is not just marksmanship," he said, eyes returning to Dean. "It is observation, discipline, and understanding. Skill earned through time, patience, and attention to detail. Remember that." Dean exhaled slowly, a measured breath that seemed to release the tension in the air, resting his hands lightly on the rifle now lying across the bench. The hills beyond the range shimmered in the late light, and for a moment, everything felt suspended: the wind, the flags, the dust, the soft hum of distant vehicles, all part of a lesson no manual could teach. The recruits absorbed the weight of it silently, each recognizing that they had witnessed something beyond skill, beyond instruction, beyond what could be quantified. Dean looked at them finally, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tracing the edges of his weathered face, as though granting permission for the understanding they had just begun to grasp. Miller straightened and took a slow step back. Colonel Richards nodded once more, and the range seemed to exhale collectively, leaving in its place a stillness that carried respect, reflection, and the quiet acknowledgement that some lessons were learned not through words but through the demonstration of a life lived with precision and patience. The sun drifted lower toward the horizon, painting the distant hills in shades of gold and amber. Long shadows stretched across the firing range, softening the hard lines of concrete, gravel, and steel. The atmosphere had changed completely. What had begun as an ordinary training day now felt like something the recruits would remember for years. Dean Peters stood quietly beside the bench, the M40 resting within arm's reach. He seemed untouched by the attention surrounding him. The same calm expression remained on his weathered face. The same steady eyes continued studying the landscape beyond the targets. Colonel Richards watched him carefully. The more he observed, the more he understood why certain names survived long after records were forgotten. Some people left impressions through rank. Others left them through stories. A rare few left them through example. Dean belonged to the last category. Lance Corporal Evans finally gathered enough courage to step forward. His boots crunched softly against the gravel as he approached. The other recruits watched closely. Hours earlier, he had been the loudest voice on the range. Now his words came slowly, carefully. "Mr. Peters," he said. Dean turned toward him. "Yes." Evans hesitated. The question seemed simple, but somehow it felt important. "When did you know you were that good?" A faint smile appeared at the corner of Dean's mouth. Not pride. Something gentler. Almost amused. He looked toward the distant target line before answering. "I never did." The recruits exchanged puzzled glances. Evans frowned slightly. "But you just made a shot nobody here could make." Dean nodded. "That is because I was not trying to prove I could make it." The answer settled over the group. Quiet. Unexpected. The breeze stirred again, tugging at shirts and range flags. Dean rested a hand on the rifle stock. "Most people spend their lives trying to prove something," he continued. "The best lessons come when you stop worrying about yourself and start paying attention to everything else." The recruits listened in complete silence. Even Gunnery Sergeant Miller remained motionless. Dean pointed toward the hills. "Watch the grass. Watch the shadows. Watch the birds. Watch the way the wind moves dust across the ground. The world is always talking." He paused. Most people are too busy talking back. A few recruits smiled quietly. The tension that had dominated the day was gone now. In its place was curiosity, respect, understanding. Colonel Richards folded his arms and nodded slightly. The lesson had become something larger than marksmanship, larger than shooting, larger than the range itself. Dean glanced upward as a flock of birds crossed the sky in a loose formation. The fading sunlight reflected briefly in his pale blue eyes. For a moment, another memory surfaced. A younger version of himself standing beside an older instructor many decades earlier. The same lesson, the same patience, the same quiet wisdom passed from one generation to another. The faces changed. The lesson remained. The memory faded. Dean returned his attention to the young men standing before him. Their expressions were different now. The arrogance was gone. In its place was respect earned honestly. Not through orders, not through rank, through understanding. Colonel Richards looked down the firing line and made a decision. "Gather around," he called. The recruits immediately moved closer. "There are training records," he said, "and then there are opportunities." His eyes shifted toward Dean. "You are looking at one right now." A hush fell over the group once more. The sun touched the horizon, casting the range in warm orange light. Dean looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention, but he did not leave. He simply stood there, quiet as ever, while an entire generation of young soldiers began seeing him not as an old man with a worn rifle, but as a living lesson standing in front of them. The sun had nearly dipped below the distant hills, leaving streaks of amber and violet across the sky. The firing range seemed quieter now, each detail more pronounced: the gentle flutter of flags, the faint hum of the distant generators, the dust still settling from earlier movements. Dean Peters stood beside the bench, hands resting lightly on the worn M40, his pale blue eyes scanning the horizon with the calm assurance of someone who had seen decades pass while learning patience and precision. The recruits remained clustered, their earlier laughter and chatter completely gone, replaced by a reverent stillness, each young soldier processing what they had witnessed. Lance Corporal Evans stood at the edge of the group, shoulders straightening, understanding for the first time that mastery was not about speed, strength, or arrogance. It was about observation, attention, and experience accumulated over a lifetime. Gunnery Sergeant Miller stepped closer to Dean, adjusting his cap against the fading sunlight, the quiet authority in his movements echoing the respect he had long carried for those who had earned it. Colonel Richards watched from a short distance, his hands folded behind his back, observing the subtle exchanges and the shift in atmosphere, recognizing that the lesson had transcended simple marksmanship. Dean lifted the rifle slightly, fingers brushing along the gouge in the stock, feeling the history embedded in every scratch and mark, the memory of countless hours spent learning, observing, and perfecting the craft that now seemed almost magical to the recruits. Another subtle breeze moved across the range, carrying the faint scent of warm gravel and sun-baked grass, mingling with the lingering trace of gun oil. Dean exhaled slowly, a deliberate motion that seemed to release a subtle tension in the air, and then looked toward each of the young men in turn. His gaze conveyed patience, understanding, and a silent expectation. He did not need to speak. The lesson was already absorbed. Colonel Richards nodded faintly, acknowledging the demonstration of skill and composure, and the way Dean had transformed the perspective of an entire group of young soldiers without a single raised voice. The recruits straightened instinctively, each contemplating the subtle power of quiet experience, the idea that knowledge and ability often moved silently beneath the surface, unseen until called upon. The hills beyond glowed softly as the last rays of sunlight brushed the tops of the flags, and Dean lowered his gaze to the rifle one final time, allowing it to rest against the bench. The wind whispered through the range, carrying a faint, timeless rhythm, and the young men sensed the weight of history, discipline, and respect embodied in the quiet figures standing before them. In that moment, the day's lessons crystallized. True mastery demanded patience, attentiveness, and a lifetime of quiet dedication. The recruits absorbed it without question, the weight of understanding settling into their posture, their expressions, their very presence. Dean turned slowly toward the exit path, each step measured, unhurried, carrying with him the quiet dignity of someone who had lived long enough to understand that respect is earned through consistency and patience, and that some lessons are best taught not with words but through presence, skill, and the calm authority of a life fully lived. The range remained still in his wake, a space transformed by the silent force of experience and the subtle power of a veteran's enduring wisdom.